In the heart of Jefferson County, Alabama, a battle for justice was about to explode in the very place that was supposed to uphold it. Judge Elaine Carter, a longtime symbol of unchecked power and corruption, had terrorized countless people during her reign in the courtroom. But today, defense attorney Michael Richards was determined to challenge her oppressive tactics in the trial of Tyrone Scott, a man wrongfully accused. What no one saw coming, though, was the shocking turn of events when federal agents barged in, arresting the judge on serious charges of bribery and civil rights violations. This wasn't just a victory for one case, it was a devastating blow to a corrupt system that had long protected figures like her. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Carter, once untouchable, was led away in handcuffs, a symbol of how even the most powerful can be held accountable. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories, and hit the bell for updates. In the heart of Jefferson County, Alabama, Judge Elaine Carter had long been known for her iron fist on the bench. Her tenure at the courthouse had lasted more than 2 decades, during which she earned a reputation for not only her biased rulings but for her complete disregard for the very principles of justice she was supposed to uphold. To many, she was a symbol of unchecked power, someone who, over the years, used her position to silence dissent, crush those who dared to challenge her, and systematically destroy the lives of anyone who crossed her path. Her courtroom was a place where fairness had long since been abandoned. The scales of justice seemed tipped from the start, and for anyone brave enough to speak out against her rulings, the consequences were swift and often severe. Judge Carter's bias was not subtle, it was blatant, especially when it came to black attorneys. Her hostility toward those who represented marginalized communities was evident in the way she dismissed their objections, belittled their arguments, and systematically denied them the chance to represent their clients with dignity. One of her most frequent targets was a defense attorney named Michael Richards. A talented lawyer, Michael had built a strong reputation for dismantling prosecutions with precision and intelligence. But that did little to shield him from Judge Carter's discriminatory tactics. Michael had faced her wrath countless times, but today would be different. Today, he would enter her courtroom with the determination to challenge her actions and expose the corrupt practices that had stained the judicial system for far too long. Michael's most recent case, the trial of Tyrone Scott, a man wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit, had brought him back into the very court where he had suffered so many injustices. Tyrone had been arrested under dubious circumstances, with evidence that was flimsy at best. Michael knew that, under a fair judge, Tyrone's case would easily fall apart. However, he also knew that Judge Carter's record of dismissing facts and disregarding justice was a real threat to his client's chances. Still, Michael was determined to push back, knowing that this case could be a crucial turning point, not only for his client but for the judicial system as a whole. Michael's entry into the courtroom was marked by a wave of tension. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, but as he looked across the room and saw Judge Carter sitting there with her usual air of superiority, he steeled himself for the battle that was about to unfold. He knew that winning would require more than just legal arguments, it would require him to expose the deep-seated corruption that had festered under her rule for so long. Michael Richards walked into the courtroom with a sense of purpose that matched the weight of the case before him. Tyrone Scott, his client, sat quietly beside him, his face a mask of frustration and helplessness. Tyrone had been falsely accused of a robbery he didn't commit, and Michael was determined to get him the justice he deserved. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, many of whom had come to witness the ongoing tension between Michael and Judge Elaine Carter. Their conflict was no secret. Michael had long been vocal about the injustices he believed Judge Carter perpetuated, and this case was no different. As Michael stepped up to present his argument, he could feel the familiar weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him. Judge Carter's cold, disapproving gaze was ever present, a constant reminder of the uphill battle he faced. Despite his experience and the overwhelming evidence in favor of his client, he knew that Judge Carter had already made up her mind. In her eyes, the system was one that worked to maintain the status quo, and people like Tyrone Scott were nothing more than inconveniences to be dealt with. The trial began, and Michael immediately found himself at odds with the judge. Her dismissive attitude toward his objections was apparent as she waved off his requests for a fair hearing, cutting him off mid-sentence as if he were an annoyance. Every move Michael made was met with resistance. She would deny his motions without consideration, ignore his points about prosecutorial misconduct, and blatantly side with the prosecution on virtually every issue. Yet, despite her attempts to undermine his every move, Michael remained steadfast. He used every legal argument at his disposal, from challenging the lack of evidence to calling attention to the mishandling of the case by law enforcement. But every objection he raised was swiftly dismissed, and the tension in the courtroom mounted with every passing minute. Michael knew that he was up against more than just a biased judge. He was up against a system that had long allowed judges like Carter to operate without consequence. As the trial continued, Michael felt the frustration building inside him. The case against Tyrone Scott was weak, built on a shaky foundation of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony that contradicted itself. But Judge Carter's behavior only further complicated things. She had already made her decision. Tyrone was guilty in her eyes, and no amount of legal reasoning or truth-telling would change that. The stakes were high, but Michael refused to back down. He knew that Tyrone's life depended on him doing everything in his power to challenge the court's proceedings. As the day wore on, he found himself questioning whether it was worth it, whether the battle for justice could ever truly be won in a system that protected people like Judge Carter. But then he remembered why he became a lawyer in the first place: to fight for those who had no voice, to stand up against corruption, and to expose the truth, no matter the cost. With that resolve, Michael asked for a mistrial. He knew the grounds for his request. He cited a Brady violation, the failure of the prosecution to disclose exculpatory evidence. But Michael wasn't naive. He knew that Judge Carter would likely deny his motion. Still, he had to ask, had to push her to expose her bias. His hope was not that the mistrial would be granted, but that it would force her to reveal herself to the world. He knew this case was not just about Tyrone, it was about exposing the deep flaws in a system that had long been broken. As Michael made his argument, he saw Judge Carter's face tighten with anger. She had always hated being challenged, and he knew she would retaliate. But he was prepared. He was ready to fight for what was right, even if the odds were stacked against him. It was at that pivotal moment, as Michael Richards made his request for a mistrial, that the unexpected happened. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the audience holding their breath as Michael presented his argument. Just as Judge Carter was about to respond, most likely with the same dismissive attitude she had displayed throughout the trial, the doors of the courtroom slammed open, and a group of federal agents entered. The courtroom fell silent, the agents' presence alone sending a shockwave through the room. The tension reached a boiling point as the agents, dressed in their usual black suits, made their way toward Judge Carter's bench. Michael, momentarily stunned, couldn't help but feel a rush of hope. Had the moment finally arrived? Had the system, which had long protected corrupt figures like Carter, finally turned against her? Without a word, the lead agent stepped forward, announcing that Judge Elaine Carter was under arrest. The charges were serious: bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The courtroom gasped as the reality of the situation hit home. Judge Carter, the very person who had wielded her authority with impunity for so long, was now being taken into custody. The sight of the woman who had terrorized so many, who had dismantled countless careers and lives, being led away in handcuffs was both shocking and satisfying. For the first time in her career, Judge Carter lost control of the situation. Her smug demeanor vanished, replaced by sheer disbelief. She tried to protest, but the agents were firm. The law had finally caught up with her. As the agents moved to arrest her, Michael calmly addressed the courtroom. His voice was steady, his words powerful. He turned to Judge Carter, who was now standing before the agents, and stated, "You failed to follow the law, Judge. You failed the very system you were sworn to uphold. Today, justice is finally being served." The words hung in the air as the courtroom processed what had just happened. The victory was bittersweet. Michael knew that it wasn't just about one corrupt judge being taken down. It was about the system that had protected her for so long, the system that had failed to hold her accountable. Today, that system had been shaken to its core. As Judge Carter was led away, Michael turned to Tyrone Scott, who had been silently watching the proceedings. The charges against Tyrone were finally dismissed, and the courtroom erupted into quiet murmurs of relief. It was a moment of justice, but Michael knew that the battle was far from over. The fight to reform the system, to rid it of corruption and bias, would continue. Today, however, was a small but significant victory. Michael sat back in his chair, reflecting on the long fight it had taken to expose Judge Carter's corruption. He knew that the road to justice was still long, but this victory was a sign that change was possible. As he looked around the courtroom, he saw a glimmer of hope for the future, a future where justice would no longer be something that could be bought or manipulated. This battle was over, but the war for true justice was just beginning. And Michael Richards was ready to continue the fight. The courtroom, which had witnessed countless cases and dramas over the years, was now alive with a different kind of tension. Judge Elizabeth Mason, a woman known for her rigidity and complete control over the room, had never before been challenged quite like this. She had ruled with an iron fist, silencing attorneys who dared question her and using her position to punish those she didn't like. Her reputation in the court system had always been one of arrogance and disregard for justice, but today, things would take an unexpected turn. The person challenging her authority wasn't just a random attorney, he was someone who had faced her biased decisions before and had vowed to expose her corrupt practices. Adrian Clark, a seasoned defense attorney with a history of exposing injustice, stepped into the courtroom. His client, Tyrone Barnes, was an innocent man accused of a crime he didn't commit. Adrian had no illusions about the difficulty of this case. He was up against not just a biased prosecutor, but the system itself, embodied in Judge Mason. However, Adrian's reputation as a formidable lawyer who could dismantle the most robust cases was well earned, and he was determined to expose the truth, no matter the consequences. As Adrian entered the courtroom, his eyes briefly met Judge Mason's. He could feel the familiar weight of her gaze, one that always seemed to carry a hint of disdain for anyone who dared question her authority. But Adrian wasn't here to cower. He had come to fight for Tyrone, and he wasn't going to let Mason's well-established corruption go unchecked. He had prepared himself for the challenge of facing a judge who had long been known for her biased rulings, especially against black defendants, and he knew this case was bigger than Tyrone's freedom. It was about exposing the system that had allowed this corruption to thrive unchecked for so long. The case began, and from the very first moment, it was clear that Judge Mason wasn't going to make this easy. She immediately dismissed Adrian's objections, rolling her eyes as he made his first attempt to present evidence of the prosecution's failure to disclose crucial information. The prosecution, who had always had her favor, seemed smug and confident that Mason would shield them from any scrutiny. Adrian, however, was not deterred. He kept his cool, knowing that his fight wasn't just against the prosecutors but against a judge who had long abused her power to manipulate cases in favor of the system. As the trial continued, Judge Mason became more combative. Every time Adrian raised an objection, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand, her voice dripping with contempt. She regularly interrupted him, cutting him off mid-sentence and belittling his legal arguments, making it clear that she had no intention of giving him a fair chance. The courtroom, filled with a mixture of onlookers, reporters, and other legal professionals, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the clear display of bias from the judge. However, no one in the room had the courage to speak out. It was always the same when Judge Mason was in charge. Her authority was absolute, and any attempt to challenge it was met with swift retaliation. Despite the obstacles, Adrian was resolute. He had anticipated this and had come prepared. While Judge Mason made her arbitrary rulings and openly disregarded the law, Adrian used her actions to his advantage. Every time she dismissed his motions or interrupted him, he made a mental note, preparing his case for the inevitable moment when he would expose her conduct. He knew that it wasn't enough to win Tyrone's case, he had to make sure that the entire system knew what kind of Judge Mason was. Adrian began to systematically push Judge Mason to expose herself, subtly and strategically. Every objection, every motion for mistrial, every challenge to her authority was designed not just to help Tyrone's case, but to push Judge Mason to reveal her deep-seated bias. Adrian knew that the more she dismissed him, the clearer it would become to everyone in the courtroom that she was not a neutral party. She was not just biased, she was actively undermining the legal process in favor of the prosecution, and he was going to make sure that everyone saw it. When Adrian finally asked for a mistrial based on the blatant Brady violation, a failure by the prosecution to disclose exculpatory evidence, Judge Mason immediately denied his request. She didn't even try to hide her disdain. "I don't see the relevance of your argument, Mr. Clark. This motion is denied," she said curtly. Her refusal to even consider his claim was further proof that she was not interested in justice. She had already made her decision, Tyrone was guilty, and no matter what evidence Adrian presented, she would not let him win. But Adrian knew this was the exact moment he had been preparing for. He had pushed her too far, and now, he had her where he wanted her. Adrian took a deep breath and looked directly at Judge Mason. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm and steady, "I've given you every opportunity to follow the law, but it's clear to me now that you're not interested in doing so. The system, which you are sworn to uphold, is being violated here, and you, Judge Mason, are complicit in it. I will not allow this case to continue under such blatant injustice." The courtroom fell silent. Everyone present could feel the weight of Adrian's words. For the first time, the reality of the situation was clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just a routine trial, it was a battle for fairness in a system that had long allowed corruption to thrive. Before Judge Mason could respond, there was a sudden noise at the courtroom door. The tension in the room shifted as federal agents, dressed in black suits, stepped into the room. The audience gasped as the agents moved toward the bench. They had come for Judge Mason. "Judge Elizabeth Mason, you are under arrest," the lead agent announced. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the agents moved to handcuff Judge Mason, who was now visibly shaken. For the first time in her career, she lost control of the situation. Her usual composed and commanding presence evaporated as she stammered, trying to process what was happening. Adrian stood in place, his face stoic. He had expected this moment, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not just for Tyrone's case, but for the corruption that had infected the entire judicial system. He turned to face the judge, his words sharp and clear. "You failed to uphold the law, Judge Mason. You've abused your position and destroyed the lives of countless people. Today, that ends." As Judge Mason was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Adrian felt a sense of vindication. The system had finally taken a step toward accountability. But this was only the beginning. Adrian knew that the battle wasn't over. One corrupt judge's arrest didn't fix the systemic problems that had allowed people like her to thrive in positions of power. There were more battles to fight, more reforms to push for, and more corruption to expose. But today, for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. The arrest of Judge Elizabeth Mason sent shockwaves through the courthouse and beyond. For years, she had been a fixture in the Jefferson County legal system, feared and revered in equal measure. Her authority had been unchallenged, and her biased rulings were accepted as part of the system. But now, with federal agents marching her out of the courtroom in handcuffs, everything had changed. The courtroom, which had once been a place of tension and injustice, was now filled with a sense of disbelief. What had just happened? Was this really the end of the reign of a judge who had controlled so many lives? Adrian Clark stood at the front of the courtroom, watching as Judge Mason was led away. His heart was racing, but he knew this was a moment of profound significance. It wasn't just about her downfall, it was about the systemic issues that had allowed her to operate unchecked for so long. He had set out to defend Tyrone Barnes, but in the process, he had exposed something far greater, a deeply flawed system that had protected corrupt individuals like Judge Mason for years. In the days following the arrest, the media frenzy surrounding Judge Mason's fall from grace escalated. News outlets around the country picked up the story, and soon, Adrian was thrust into the spotlight. Interviews, press conferences, and requests for statements poured in as reporters sought to understand how such a powerful figure could have been allowed to operate with impunity for so long. Adrian became the face of a movement calling for reform in the judicial system, his legal acumen now seen as a symbol of resistance against the entrenched corruption that had tainted the courts. But the battle for justice was far from over. As federal agents began their investigation into Judge Mason's corruption, it quickly became clear that her misconduct had been far-reaching. Bribery, abuse of power, and civil rights violations were just the beginning of the charges against her. The scope of her criminal activity began to unfold, with more victims coming forward, each with their own story of how Mason had used her position to destroy lives. Adrian knew that exposing one judge, no matter how powerful, wasn't enough to change the system. The truth was, Mason wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a larger, deeply entrenched system of injustice that needed to be reformed. The media coverage, while extensive, only scratched the surface of what needed to be done. The legal system needed more than just the removal of one corrupt official, it needed to be overhauled from the ground up. The protests that had erupted in support of Tyrone Barnes and Adrian's efforts did not subside after Mason's arrest. Instead, they grew in intensity. People across the country took to the streets, demanding greater accountability and reform within the judicial system. Activists, civil rights organizations, and legal professionals joined forces to push for widespread changes that would prevent another Judge Mason from rising to power. Adrian became a key figure in this movement. Though he had initially sought justice for his client, he now found himself fighting for something far larger, the integrity of the entire legal system. He knew that this was not a battle that would be won overnight. The fight for systemic change would require years of work, legislation, and public advocacy. But for the first time in his career, he felt like change was not only possible, it was inevitable. The fall of Judge Elizabeth Mason sent ripples through the legal community and beyond. The courthouse where she had wielded unchecked power for years now stood as a symbol of the deep-rooted issues within the justice system. Her arrest, orchestrated by federal agents in front of the entire courtroom, had been a shocking moment of accountability. However, for Adrian Clark, the defense attorney who had pushed tirelessly to expose her corruption, the victory felt bittersweet. The battle was far from over. Adrian had set out to defend his client, Tyrone Barnes, a man wrongfully accused and caught in the web of a broken system. What began as a simple case of injustice against an innocent man had snowballed into a larger reckoning with the very institutions that had long been allowed to operate with impunity. Judge Mason's arrest was a significant milestone, but it was just one step toward addressing the broader issue of systemic corruption within the legal and law enforcement sectors. While the media and public attention were focused on the high-profile case, Adrian knew that his work had just begun. The outrage sparked by Judge Mason's fall had been unprecedented, but it wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about the thousands of others who, like her, were entrenched in the system. The fight for Tyrone's freedom had highlighted the flaws in a justice system that often failed the very people it was meant to protect. It had exposed the discriminatory practices that affected black defendants, the lack of accountability for law enforcement, and the passive acceptance of corruption that had been allowed to persist for decades. Adrian began working with legal reform groups, civil rights organizations, and lawmakers to push for systemic changes that would address these issues head-on. The fight for justice was no longer just about individual cases, it was about creating a fairer, more transparent system for everyone, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, or political influence. It was about dismantling the barriers that allowed corruption and bias to thrive and rebuilding the system with true accountability at its core. The first battle in this ongoing fight was the push for judicial reform. Adrian worked alongside other legal professionals to draft new legislation aimed at increasing transparency in the appointment of judges and ensuring that those in power were held accountable for their actions. His role in the movement became increasingly prominent as the media coverage of Judge Mason's arrest continued to grow. He was invited to speak at rallies, forums, and conferences, where he advocated for a broader examination of how the legal system operated. He called for the implementation of independent oversight bodies that would monitor judicial conduct, ensure fairness in trials, and provide greater oversight of prosecutors and defense attorneys alike. However, pushing for legislative change was no easy feat. Many within the legal community were resistant to reform. Some viewed Adrian's calls for change as an attack on the profession, while others feared that introducing more oversight would undermine the authority of the courts. But Adrian was undeterred. He knew that the only way to move forward was to confront these challenges head-on. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was a fight worth having. In the aftermath of Judge Mason's arrest, Adrian found himself navigating the delicate balance between pushing for reforms and dealing with the immediate consequences of the case. Tyrone's trial had been a victory, but it was just one case in a system that was still broken. The public's demand for accountability was only the beginning of a much larger battle for reform. Adrian knew that the more momentum the movement gained, the harder it would be for those in power to ignore the call for change. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Adrian faced constant pushback from those who had benefited from the existing system. But with each step, he began to see the cracks in the foundation of the legal system grow wider. The movement for change was growing stronger, and people across the country were beginning to speak out against the injustices they had long tolerated. As the months passed, Adrian's work took on a new sense of urgency. The momentum for change continued to build, and the battle for justice seemed more achievable than ever. But Adrian knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for accountability, transparency, and fairness in the justice system would continue for years to come. Adrian stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the imposing building that had once been the site of so many battles for justice. Today, however, felt different. The sun was setting on the city of Birmingham, casting long shadows over the stone steps. For the first time in his career, Adrian felt a sense of cautious optimism. The victory he had won for Tyrone Barnes, and the subsequent fall of Judge Elizabeth Mason, had sparked something bigger. It wasn't just about one corrupt judge, it was about a system that had long been complicit in protecting the powerful while crushing the powerless. The fight for systemic change was far from over, but Adrian knew that the momentum was on their side. In the wake of Judge Mason's arrest, a wave of public support had flooded in. Protests and rallies calling for judicial reform had spread across the country, fueled by the growing recognition that the justice system needed to be overhauled from top to bottom. Legal professionals, activists, and everyday citizens were coming together in a way that Adrian had never seen before. For the first time in a long while, people were demanding accountability, not just from individual officers or judges, but from the entire system. As Adrian worked to push for broader reforms, he was forced to confront the challenges of working within a system that was resistant to change. The more he spoke out against the corruption and bias that ran rampant within the courts, the more resistance he faced. Many of the powerful figures within the legal community were reluctant to acknowledge the flaws in the system, and some actively fought against the reforms Adrian was advocating for. But for every voice of opposition, there were hundreds more calling for change. The public's demand for accountability was impossible to ignore. One of the most significant hurdles Adrian faced was the widespread reluctance to acknowledge the role that racism played in the justice system. The legal system, particularly in places like Birmingham, had long been built on a foundation of racial inequality. For decades, black defendants had been treated unfairly, often with their cases dismissed or handled with blatant disregard for the law. Even as the country moved toward greater awareness of these issues, many within the legal community continued to resist confronting the systemic racism embedded in the courts. But Adrian was undeterred. He knew that the only way to create lasting change was to bring these issues into the light. His legal battles, first for Tyrone and then in the fight for judicial reform, were not just about winning cases, they were about changing minds and pushing the legal community to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for too long. He began working with legislators to introduce bills that would create independent oversight committees for judges and prosecutors, ensuring that they were held accountable for their actions. He pushed for the establishment of a national database that tracked judicial misconduct and allowed citizens to report abuses of power. He also called for increased diversity in the appointment of judges and prosecutors, believing that a more representative legal system would be less likely to perpetuate the biases that had plagued the courts for so long. In addition to his legislative work, Adrian continued to fight for individual cases, making sure that the voices of those who had been wronged were heard. He worked with civil rights organizations to provide legal aid to underserved communities and helped to push for the exoneration of wrongfully convicted individuals. Each case, no matter how small, was a step toward creating a more just and equitable system. Despite the setbacks, Adrian's resolve only grew stronger. The road to reform was long and fraught with challenges, but he knew that each step forward brought them closer to the change they so desperately needed. Months passed, and the movement for judicial reform continued to gain momentum. Adrian's tireless efforts had sparked a nationwide conversation about the deep-seated problems within the legal system. The arrest of Judge Elizabeth Mason had been the catalyst for this conversation, but it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. The reforms Adrian had advocated for had begun to take shape, but they were not without resistance. Many of the entrenched figures in the legal system still held on to their power, unwilling to relinquish their control over the courts. But with each passing day, the pressure for change grew. More cases of judicial misconduct were being exposed, and the public's trust in the system began to erode. Adrian continued to fight, but he knew that the road ahead would be long. The legal system was built on a foundation of power and privilege, and tearing that down would take time. But he also knew that change was possible. The public outcry, the growing number of legal reforms, and the increasing awareness of the systemic issues within the justice system all pointed toward a future where justice was more than just a concept, it was something that could be achieved. As Adrian reflected on the progress that had been made, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had helped to expose the flaws in a broken system, and he had played a key role in the movement for reform. But he also knew that the work was far from finished. The fight for justice, accountability, and equality would continue, and he was ready to keep pushing forward. The battle for a fairer justice system was not just about one case or one judge, it was about the future of the entire system. It was about creating a legal system where all people, regardless of their race or background, could have faith that they would receive a fair trial. And Adrian Clarke was determined to see that vision realized. The journey Adrian Clarke had embarked on was never easy. The legal system, deeply rooted in tradition and power, had resisted change at every turn. But with each victory, no matter how small, Adrian felt that they were slowly but surely tearing down the walls of injustice that had long protected the corrupt and the powerful. As the movement for judicial reform continued to grow, Adrian knew that the battle was far from over. The legal system had been built over generations, and reforming it would take time and persistence. But with every case, every rally, and every voice that joined the fight, Adrian felt the momentum shifting. The system that had once allowed corrupt judges like Elizabeth Mason to thrive was now under scrutiny, and the pressure for reform was undeniable. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Adrian remained steadfast in his commitment to justice. He knew that the fight for fairness in the courts was not just about legal battles, it was about a broader cultural shift, one that would require the legal community, lawmakers, and the public to come together to address the systemic issues that had plagued the system for so long. And so, Adrian Clarke continued his work, knowing that the road to a truly just system would be long and difficult. As Adrian Clarke stood outside the courthouse, watching the final stages of the reforms he had long fought for come to life, he couldn't help but reflect on the long, difficult journey that had brought him here. The fight against judicial corruption, symbolized by the fall of Judge Elizabeth Mason, had ignited a fire that would not be easily extinguished. It was a battle that had demanded everything from him, his time, his energy, his reputation, but it had also been a fight for something much larger than himself, a more just and accountable legal system. The movement for judicial reform, sparked by Mason's arrest, had grown into a nationwide call for change. Adrian had helped lead that charge, using his platform as a defense attorney in his relentless pursuit of justice to push for the systemic reforms that the public demanded. What started as a single case of corruption had morphed into a broad and powerful movement. Now, the system was beginning to change, though Adrian knew that change would be gradual and that the work was far from finished. The legal reforms that Adrian had worked on were starting to be implemented. Independent oversight bodies had been established to monitor the conduct of judges and prosecutors, ensuring that they would be held accountable for their actions. New legislation was being introduced that aimed to increase transparency in the judicial process and provide better safeguards against corruption. While these changes were significant, Adrian knew they were just the beginning. The system still had deep flaws, and it would take years of continued effort to truly dismantle the entrenched biases that had existed for so long. But for the first time, Adrian felt hopeful. The tide had shifted. Public support for judicial reform had grown, and the conversation around systemic bias and corruption in the legal system was no longer something that could be easily ignored. The struggle was not over, but Adrian had seen the power of collective action, and he had witnessed firsthand how one case, one movement, could spark a change in an entire system. As the sun set behind the courthouse, casting a golden glow over the building, Adrian knew that his work was far from complete. But he also knew that the fight for justice, once thought impossible to win, had already begun to take root. The road ahead would be long, but the foundation for change had been laid. And with every victory, big or small, Adrian was reminded that justice, though often slow, was worth fighting for. With a deep breath, Adrian turned and walked away from the courthouse, ready for the next step in the ongoing fight for a fairer, more just legal system. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in his career, Adrian was confident that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. In the heart of a deeply flawed legal system, one attorney, Michael Richards, stood firm in his pursuit of justice, challenging the status quo that had allowed corruption to thrive for decades. This battle wasn't just for his client, Tyrone Scott, who had been wrongfully accused, but for the very integrity of the justice system. Judge Elaine Carter, a symbol of unchecked power and bias, had terrorized many before, manipulating the system to punish the vulnerable and silence those who dared to challenge her authority. However, Michael's steadfast courage and legal expertise paved the way for the unthinkable, Judge Carter's arrest, not just for her crimes, but as a glaring symbol that the system, which had long protected her, was beginning to crack. This story carries profound lessons on perseverance, accountability, and the need for systemic change. Michael Richards didn't just defend his client, he stood up against a corrupt system that valued power over justice. His fight was personal, but it became much more. It became a battle for fairness and equality within a system that had long turned a blind eye to its flaws. When the unthinkable happened, and federal agents stormed the courtroom to arrest Judge Carter, it was a moment of accountability. The message was clear: no one, not even the most powerful, is beyond the reach of the law. The victory wasn't just in winning a single case, it was in exposing the truth and shining a light on the need for widespread reform. The arrest of Judge Carter sparked a movement, a call for systemic reform that would resonate far beyond the courtroom. Adrian Clark, another defense attorney, played a pivotal role in pushing for broader changes, advocating for judicial reforms that would increase transparency and ensure accountability for those in power. But what's more important here is the message that change is possible, even when the odds are stacked against us. The legal system, like many institutions, had become mired in corruption and bias. But through collective action, resilience, and unwavering determination, those in power can be held accountable. The journey to reform is often long and difficult. It requires not just legal battles but a shift in societal values. It's about breaking down entrenched systems of power and privilege, creating spaces where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, has an equal chance for justice. The struggle is ongoing, and the path to true reform is filled with challenges. But as Michael and Adrian's stories demonstrate, small victories matter. With each case, with each act of courage, we move closer to a more just world. If you find value in this story, where justice and accountability triumph over corruption and bias, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell to stay updated and continue supporting the fight for a fairer world.